Sometimes that shark, he looks right into you, right into your eyes. You know the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes. When he comes at you, he doesn't seem to be living until he bites you. And those black eyes roll over white, and then you hear that terrible high-pitched screaming. The ocean turns red, and in spite of all the pounding and the hollering, they all come in and they rip you to pieces.
Welcome, my beautiful best friends, you sweet, sweet human beings, to another episode of Pop Culture Fridays. I'm your host, as always, Troy. This week, grab that two-piece, fix up some sandwiches, make sure there's a lot of sand in that bread, grab that first aid kit, because we're going to the beach in Amity. We're going in the water. This is Jaws Explained. So if you don't know this movie, shame on you. Jaws, 1975, Stephen Spielberg, and it's a story basically of a great white shark that wants to hang out off the coast of a small town, a small island called Amity, somewhere in the Cape Cod region, and it decides it's going to feed on people, terrorize them until you kill it, and that's basically what happens. Now, there's lots of interesting theories about this movie, about this film, what it means, what the shark's a metaphor for, what's the symbolism here. And I'm going to go over a few interesting things that I found looking into it, and then I'm going to, of course, submit my own kooky theory. Now, if you've ever seen A Pervert's Guide to Ideology, which is a documentary by Slavoj Žižek, where he talks about mostly American movies and the symbolism in it and the metaphors and the propaganda and all that stuff, it's pretty interesting. Slavoj Žižek is one of those guys, though, where I feel like if you were a dog, he'd have like a little biscuit out here, trying to get you to come to it, and behind his back with his other hand would be a knife. I feel like he'd be okay with full-blown communism, and I'm not okay with that. Nevertheless, I think he has a couple of interesting theories, a couple of interesting things to say about the movie Jaws. The first thing, apparently Fidel Castro thought it was quite obvious that the shark was some sort of metaphor for capitalism, that it was eating the people alive, causing terror, panic, hysteria, and that's what they experienced their whole lives. Maybe, possibly. Another theory is that the shark represents xenophobia, the foreign threat, the foreign invader. Whether it's through immigration or conquest or whatever, you've got people afraid of something new coming to their shores. That's also possible. I think it's a little too obvious, but it's definitely an interesting theory. Žižek, I think, goes on to say that it's, at the same time, all of these things and none of them. I don't know what the hell that means. However, what I will say is I think, before I get into my own thing, I think it could be quite simply two things. One, it could just be a representation of change. You've got all these people on this island, they've got the habit of, it's cold winter, it's the summertime comes, the tourism's hot, the two pieces are hot, the cash is hot, everything's flowing, and then all of a sudden comes along this shark, Mother Nature, Earth, throwing things at you, like an asteroid or a virus, something like that, to where you have to adapt to the change, and if you don't, you suffer the consequences. So I think that's entirely possible. However, I may be oversimplifying this. I realize that we're watching a movie about a shark that kills and eats people and plays psychological terror games. I think this movie is simply about one thing, death. I think the shark is death, and I think the whole movie is about our fear of death and how we look at it. I mean, we fear death more than anything. We think about it probably more than we want to, and we probably don't have a very good relationship with it. Now, I'm speaking mostly from a Western or an American standpoint, I suppose. But I don't think we have like a healthy view of it. I know I don't. And I think the shark is something that represents that. That could fall under the change category as well. You're living one moment, enjoying life on the beach, you've got two pieces all around you, and the next thing you know, you can't go into the water because some asshole's out there killing people. But all the characters in this movie, Brody, Hooper, Quint, the mayor is what, if you had to argue about capitalism, the mayor is what represents capitalism. It's sort of like the situation now with the coronavirus. You've got things reopening. Nobody really knows exactly what's going on, but yet we seem to be pushing the economy perhaps more than the health of people, or maybe we were pushing it in the reverse too much. I don't know. But I don't think the shark represents capitalism, and I don't think the shark represents xenophobia. I think it's too obvious. But I think this change, the ultimate change is death. And I think that's exactly what the shark is. All these characters are agents for tradition. They want things to continue the same way. They want the summer to be hot with tourism. They want their own little town to be safe. They want to bring people in for the cash, but they don't want things to change abruptly or in a way that's going to throw everything off, everything they've ever known. That sentimentality of keeping things the same. I think that's what that shark is. That change. I mean, to me, the interesting thing about the characters, particularly Brody, Hooper, and Quint, is that Quint is sort of like history. That's what he represents to me. Like he's a man of the sea. He was in the USS Indianapolis when 700 men went into that water, chief, and only 300 came out. You know, and then Hooper, the scientist, the shark specialist, he's like the scientific future. That's what's going to get us out of things. That's what's going to get us out of the coronavirus. That's what's going to get us, hopefully out of environmental disaster or whatever disaster. If you have a problem pop up like a bear that's causing problems or a shark that's causing problems, you got to know how to deal with these things. And that's the future of things. And Chief Brody is kind of like the modern day person. He sort of represents everybody. We're all looking at it through his lens. He's seeing history, Quint, and he's seeing the future, Hooper, side by side on the same boat trying to kill a fish. That's what it's all about, man. One of the interesting things, if you look at the succession of victims, that's kind of a weird way to put it, but the first victim was Chrissy. She was like a young girl. I don't know if she was a teenager or not, but she was drinking, smoking grass, and she went skinny dipping. She's dead. Second victim, Alex Kittner, 10-year-old, maybe 11-year-old boy, gets killed. So other than maybe the other old guy that gets killed and Quint, you've kind of got the shark, if it's death, if that's what it represents, just let's just go with that for a minute. What's more of a betrayal to life than the death of young people? I mean, you feel like, it's sad when somebody, especially if you're somebody you know, who's 90 years old or 80 years old and they die. But when an 80 or 90-year-old dies, you're kind of like, okay. But if a 10-year-old dies, if a 17-year-old dies, you feel like you were robbed of time, you were robbed of life. So I think it struck me as more impactful that if the shark is death, that the first few victims you had were children or young people. One thing I also want to mention is in a different episode I talked about something that was mentioned in the podcast In Voorhees We Trust with Gorley and Rust, where they talked about how in Friday the 13th and Jaws, it was interesting to note that perhaps from a puritanical standpoint, not that the directors were doing this on purpose, but from this sort of Christian-based or Puritan ideology, that what happens in these movies is quite often you have people who are having a good time, like the opening scene in Jaws where they're all partying and smoking grass and, people are making out or whatever. What happens to some of those people? Well, they get killed. And it's the same thing that happens in Friday the 13th with the camp counselors. They're doing the same thing. So I do think it's interesting that that could also be taken as a representation of life. You're happy, you're enjoying yourself, you're having a good time. And when you do that, sometimes I guess your defenses are down in terms of noticing like a crazy shark around you. But that's another thing that I thought was interesting and sort of like an emphasis of life, perhaps. Now, the last potentially interesting bit I have about the shark being death is something that Quint says. And I'm going to revert back to what I opened this episode with, a little speech where Quint, Hooper, and Brody are all on the boat at night having a few drinks. And Quint is talking about the incident where he was on the USS Indianapolis, hit by a couple of Japanese torpedoes, and 700 men go into the water. This is one of the things that he says. And the thing about a shark is he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes. When he comes at you, he doesn't even seem to be living. I mean, that's pretty much the textbook definition of death, is it not?
Farewell and adieu to you fair Spanish ladies. Farewell and adieu, you ladies of Spain. For we've received orders for to sail back to Boston. And so never more shall we see you again.
And finally, just a fun little interesting fact about the movie. That 10-year-old I mentioned, Alex Kintner, who died in Jaws, his mother was the one who ended up slapping Chief Brody on the face when he knew that the beaches should have been closed. His name, are you ready for this? And I know some of you crazy fans out there are going to know this already. That actor's name, the 10-year-old boy, his name was Jeffrey Voorhees. Dun 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 dun. You've got Jason Voorhees, who's probably about 10 years old, maybe. How does he die? In the water. Then you got Jeffrey Voorhees, who's in Amity in Jaws. How does he die? In the water. These Voorheeses are like a Saving Private Ryan kind of thing. Keep these people out of the water. I've always wondered why, like, maybe there isn't a Jaws versus Jason happening. I mean, I wouldn't cross a Voorhees, would you? I mean, we clearly know what happens if you cross a Voorhees. When you look at Jason and his mom, somebody's gonna get revenge for that other guy. I'm telling you. Well, that's all I have for you this week, my beautiful friends. You can follow me at Culture Fridays on Twitter, at Pop Culture Fridays on Instagram. The site is thisiswhereyouare.com, and I will see you next week. Farewell and adieu to fair Spanish ladies. Farewell and adieu, you ladies of Spain. For we've received orders for to set off to Boston. And so nevermore shall we see you again.